Lisbon, a city that, for a time, stood among the richest and most glamorous ports on earth. Long before London or Paris claimed their modern crowns, Lisbon opened onto the world. Its air carried scents of cinnamon and pepper, its quayways emptied the fortunes of Brazil, and the echoes of the Age of Discovery still whispered from every cobblestone. Around the early 1700s, Lisbon housed close to 200,000 souls. It ranked as Europe's fourth largest city, behind only London, Paris, and Naples. The city was a study in contrasts. A new Rome of more than 40 churches and scores of convents, yet also a medieval tangle where imperial wealth moved through streets without modern sewers. But that gilded chapter was headed toward a terrifying rupture. We will watch a metropolis vanish in a single morning and then witness how it rose again, becoming, in many respects, the first truly modern Enlightenment city. To grasp why Lisbon's fall stunned Europe, consider that by the mid-18th century, the city was the heart of a global network. This is the Tagus, the river that is Lisbon's throat and Portugal's lifeblood. In the 1730s, its harbor was literally clogged with masts. Look at Joachim Otten's engraving, and you can almost step from deck to deck across the water. Why such a forest of ships? To answer that, we must examine the 5 pillars of Portuguese preeminence that made Lisbon the hub of a world economy. Ships arrived daily, feeding what historians call the first global marketplace. The first pillar was the spice link. While rivals were still probing routes, Portugal held direct lines to the east. Goa, Malacca, Timor, places that sent pepper, cinnamon, and cloves into Lisbon's warehouses, where Europe paid handsomely. The second pillar was the silk and porcelain trade. Through Macau, Lisbon funneled coveted Chinese porcelain, the white gold coveted by aristocrats across Paris and London. Then came the African connections, ports in Angola and Mozambique that made Lisbon a gateway for ivory, rare timbers, and gold. But the most potent engine was the age of gold, the Brazilian boom. After the late 17th century discoveries in Minas Gerais, a torrent of wealth crossed the Atlantic. The numbers staggered. Hundreds of tons of gold and immense quantities of diamonds flowed into these docks in the decades before the Great Catastrophe. Such riches turned Lisbon into a cultural and scientific magnet. The crown did not merely hoard these spoils, it invested them. Kings built grand aqueducts, amassed secret nautical chart collections, the Roteiros, and transformed courts into centers of prestige. By 1750, Lisbon functioned as a global warehouse and one of Europe's principal creditors. Yet the riverfront was also a place of sharp contrasts. Dozens of languages, Dutch, English, Italian, African tongues, mixed with the rough Portuguese of the stevedores. The Ribeira glittered with treasure and reeked with daily life. Unlike inland capitals, Lisbon looked unwaveringly seaward. The Tagus was both providence and problem. It supplied fish for the hungry and imported gems for crowns, but it also served as the city's open sewer. Waste was cast from windows down the hills and swept to the river. The stench of Lisbon was notorious among visitors. Today, the Tagus is peaceful compared with the era of heavy galleons. The Ribeira has become Praça do Comércio, but the memory of that maritime bustle remains. Imagine standing before the Paço da Ribeira, the royal palace that for centuries symbolized Portuguese global reach. For over 250 years, the Ribeira Palace housed monarchs and statecraft. If Versailles broadcast French grandeur, the Ribeira reflected Portugal's maritime empire. Built from the Manueline period onward and enlarged across centuries, By the mid-1700s, it contained tens of thousands of volumes, priceless paintings by Titian, Rubens, and Correggio, and the secret logs of the Age of Discovery. King João spent gold lavishly, rivaling the splendor of Louis XIV. He used Brazilian bullion for papal favors and for turning chapels into glittering shrines of gilded stone and silver. But the palace was more than ostentation. It was the administrative nerve center of an empire stretching from South America to Southeast Asia. Clerks on its lower floors tallied pepper prices and weighed gold bars. Today, the palace is gone. Not a single stone remains on that spot. We will see why when we reach 1755. Where the palace stood is now the great open Praça do Comércio. To understand Lisbon's 18th century spirit, you must also meet its spiritual anchors above all the Jerónimos Monastery in Belém. Even in the 1700s, it stood as a 2-century-old masterpiece of Manueline architecture that weaves maritime symbols, ropes, coral, anchors into stone. The monastery was famously funded in part by the pepper tax, a levy on Eastern goods. Sailors prayed there before voyages. Survivors returned to give thanks. Nearby, the Belém Tower stood further out in the estuary than it does today, a ceremonial gateway and, at times, a grim prison with dank dungeons for political captives. Moving inland, the Carmo Convent rose over the Rossio and the waves of the city. Its library and soaring nave made it a landmark visible from most quarters. In 18th century Lisbon, the church was everywhere. Almost every corner had a chapel or bell tower. Bells marked time, announced events, and bound the civic rhythm. But this devout city also lived under the shadow of the Inquisition. In the Rossio, the city's social heart, the auto da fe, remained a public spectacle. Forced penances and executions of those accused of heresy, crypto-Judaism, witchcraft, or sodomy. While Enlightenment salons in Paris debated freedom of thought, Lisbon continued public condemnations and, at times, executions. Victims marched in San Benito's, painted penitential coats before the flames. These rituals were political as much as religious, attended by nobility and the crown. Today, the Rossio is a lively meeting place. The Inquisition's offices were replaced by the Dona Maria II National Theatre. Yet the darker history lingered in the city's fabric. Climb from the river and you enter the Alfama, Lisbon's oldest quarter, a surviving medieval maze shaped by Moorish rule and reconquest. In the 1700s, life spilled into the streets. Tiny homes forced residents to cook, wash, and socialize outside. Varinas, the fishwives, carried baskets of sardines atop their heads, selling with rhythmic cries that gave the quarter its living tempo. Water was a constant struggle. Houses lacked running supplies. The city relied on public fountains. The heavy lifting fell to the Galagos laborers from Galicia, who hauled barrels up steep slopes for the wealthy and the poor alike. Marginalized, they were nonetheless indispensable. Across the hill, the Bairro Alto was a daytime neighborhood of artisans and nobles that turned nocturnal as taverns filled and the strains of proto-fado songs of sailors and outcasts drifted through narrow lanes. Nights could be perilous. Crime was common, and chamber pots emptied into the streets at a shouted, "Agua vai!" Then came All Saints' Day, a day of packed churches, 1,000 candles and thick incense filling the altars. At 9:40 a.m., the earth began to convulse. This was not a tremor, but a catastrophic quake, later estimated between 8.5 and 9 inches magnitude. The shaking endured nearly 6 minutes, an eternity under collapsing stone. Vaulted roofs in the Carmo Convent and the Say Cathedral crumbled, burying worshippers. Narrow alleyways turned to death traps as houses leaned, toppled, and crushed those below. Survivors fled toward the Tagus, the only open refuge, and watched in disbelief as the water withdrew. 40 minutes after the shaking, a massive tsunami, perhaps 20 to 30 feet high, slammed up the river. The wave swept quays, docks, and the lower stories of palaces. But the calamity had another cruel act. The thousands of candles in the wooden wreckage ignited small fires that, hindered by rubble and a ruined water supply, grew into a 5-day inferno. Lisbon was not only shaken and drowned, it was consumed by flame. The toll was devastating. From a population near 200,000, estimates place fatalities between 30,000 and 60,000. Approximately 85% of the city's structures were destroyed. The Royal Palace, the Great Library with its 70,000 volumes, archival records of the discoveries, and priceless artworks all vanished in the blaze. Today, the Carmo Convent remains a roofless ruin, preserved as a memorial. When you stand beneath its open sky, you see what survivors saw in November 1755. A hollow skeleton of a once opulent capital. The earthquake reverberated beyond buildings. It struck the intellectual foundations of Europe. Philosophers such as Voltaire and Rousseau wrestled with how a just deity could permit such disaster, an argument that helped propel Enlightenment critiques of providence and authority. In the aftermath, King José, successor to João, reacted with fear. He reputedly avoided living within stone walls again, preferring luxury tents outside the city. Rebuilding fell to one decisive figure, Sebastião José de Carvalho e Melo, the Marquis of Pombal. Asked what should be done, Pombal reputedly replied bluntly, "Bury the dead and feed the living." A forceful pragmatist of Enlightenment bent, he treated the catastrophe as an opportunity to remake Lisbon rationally. Ignoring old ecclesiastical and noble property claims, he cleared ruins and laid out a new center, the Baixa Pombalina. Pombal introduced early seismic engineering, the Gaiola Pombalina, or Pombaline cage, a wooden internal framework that allowed buildings to flex rather than collapse. To test models, troops marched rhythmically around scale structures to simulate tremors. He standardized facades, ordered mass production of azulejos to speed reconstruction, and replaced labyrinthine alleys with broad, straight avenues to improve light, air, and movement. At the heart of his plan stood the Praça do Comércio, built on the very footprint of the former Ribeira Palace. Naming it Commerce Square was a statement. Portugal would recast itself as a mercantile, modern state rather than merely a religious empire. The Rua Augusta Arch formed a grand gateway from sea into city, and a bronze equestrian statue of the king symbolized order restored atop the ruins. Walk these squares today, and you tread over the memory of tsunami debris and burned timber. Lisbon's story is one of extremes, crowned by Brazilian gold, and then flattened by earth and fire, only to be reborn in measured stone and enlightened planning. The century that began in glitter ended in sober lines. Pombaline architecture expressed functional elegance and civic order. Beneath the tourist facades and cafes, the 18th century spirit survives in Saudade, that bittersweet Portuguese longing for what was lost. It lives in the resilient masonry of the Alfama and in the defiant arches of Carmo. Lisbon endured one of history's great urban catastrophes and chose to rebuild stronger and more rational. From imperial peaks to near annihilation and then metropolitan rebirth, the city shows that beauty can be refashioned from ruin. If this deep dive through Lisbon's golden age and its tragic pivot moved you, tell us in the comments. Which city should we resurrect next with our AI reconstructions? Edo period, Tokyo, Imperial Rome, or another lost capital? I'm Joan, watching the past, so we can better understand the present. See you in the next era.